My name is Melissa Van Bussel, and I'm a senior data analyst at Statistics Canada. But if you know me, you probably know me as the person who's been posting a lot of YouTube videos about generative AI. In the last year and a half-ish, I've spent most of my free time making videos and giving talks and workshops about how to use generative AI as an R programmer. Now, initially, this all started because I was a bit fearful of generative AI. I was really afraid that large language models were going to take my job, or worse, take over the world. And so I wanted to learn more about how these models worked, and I wanted to understand how to best use them. And the more that I started to learn about Gen AI, the less afraid I became. And in fact, the exact opposite started to happen. I started to become really excited about this stuff. I became a Gen AI fanatic, and it sort of became a special interest for me for a while. I became completely convinced that this was going to permanently change the way that I thought about programming and about data science more broadly. I wanted to talk about it with anyone who would let me, and whenever one of my friends or someone online would be skeptical about how useful the technology actually is, I was the one jumping into the conversation and proclaiming that this was the next big world-changing thing. And in some ways, I was definitely right. There's no denying that generative AI has forever changed the world as we know it. But even on a more individual level, this really did change my world. My videos started getting a lot more views than they ever had before, and people started reaching out to me more often, and my network started to grow really, really fast. And then I got the email from Hadley asking if I would talk about generative AI at this conference, and I was ecstatic. It truly felt like a dream come true. I was going to get to talk about my favorite topic at my favorite conference, surrounded by the best possible people. But as I've been preparing for this talk over the last 6 months or so, something has happened. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit this, but I started getting tired of hearing and talking about generative AI. I ended up becoming Gen AI fatigued. The more that I used these tools in different projects and in different contexts, the more walls I hit and the more frustrated I felt. And once this light switch flipped for me from fanatic to fatigued, it started to become much harder for me to have these conversations. And this definitely wasn't helped by the sheer number of posts that I would see on social media that were like this, many of which were using really aggressive marketing tactics. It was just really tiring. But as I've been preparing for this talk, I've managed to find some ways to get really excited about this stuff again. Now, I have a feeling that most people in this room have probably felt one of those three feelings at some point. Or maybe you're like me and you've even felt a combination. And as a side note here, if you feel like you don't see yourself in any of those three categories, then it might be because I probably should have called the last one Gen AI hesitant. But then I wouldn't have had 3 words that all start with the same letter. And my overly organized brain just would not have been OK with that. Either way, though, I recognize that we're all in a different place in our relationships with generative AI. And so I've tried to design this talk in a way that there's something for everyone, regardless of where you're at. If you're a Gen AI fanatic, then I want to talk about the latest and greatest improvements that we've seen recently and why you might care as someone who works with data. If you're Gen AI fatigued, then first of all, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that you have to listen to an hour-long talk about Gen AI, especially right before dinner, and especially after a full day of listening to talks that you're probably way more excited about than this one. But if you're AI fatigued, then I want to show you some creative use cases that you hopefully haven't seen before that might make you start to feel a bit excited about Gen AI again. And finally, if you're AI fearful, then I want to share some best practices for working with Gen AI tools more responsibly that will hopefully help ease some of your worries. So this first part of the talk is for the AI fanatics in the room. But before I dive into this section, I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to be a fan. Now, I'm Canadian, and I come from the country's capital, Ottawa, which is home to the world's largest skating rink, the Rideau Canal. So naturally, as you might expect, I am a huge fan of Love is Blind. Now, for those who don't know, Love is Blind is a Netflix dating reality TV show where contestants try to fall in love with each other and get engaged without ever seeing each other face to face. It's a really silly concept for a show, but it's definitely a guilty pleasure of mine. Whenever a new season is going on, I become completely obsessed, and I fully immerse myself in the Love is Blind subculture. Now, this is obviously partially because I like the show, but it's also because my social media algorithms become completely overtaken by Love is Blind content as soon as a new season is out. Like, I'll like one Instagram reel about which couples are the cutest together, and the next thing I know, I'm deep in a YouTube rabbit hole watching videos made by a therapist who psychoanalyzes each contestant and their relationships. Point being, whenever there's new content to consume, I'm consuming it. This obsession with wanting to know the latest and greatest is something that members of all fandoms have in common. Whether the thing that you're excited with or you're obsessed with is hockey, Love is Blind, or Gen AI. And for the Gen AI fans, this part is for you. We're going to be talking about the latest and greatest advancements that we've seen recently. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on OpenAI's GPT-4o model, which was just released a couple of months ago, back in May. GPT-4o is OpenAI's first model that combines text, vision, and audio capabilities all in the same model. So this means you can do things like upload images, documents, and even CSVs, and interact with all of them in the same chat interface. You can also generate and then download outputs in all of those formats as well. The other huge difference with GPT-4o is that the model's available even on the free tier subscription. So while the features I'm going to talk about here aren't technically speaking new, they might be new to anyone in the audience who hasn't been paying for a GPT Plus subscription. So one of the features that I've been finding really cool about the model is its image processing capabilities. So I can take an image on my phone, and then I can upload that photo into the chat, and then ask questions about that image. I would have loved this technology back when I was in university, because I often found myself taking pictures of math that was written out on chalkboards or whiteboards. And now, going from an image that has math in it to a digital format that has math in it is a breeze. And it's pretty accurate, too. So with this prompt here, I'm asking the model to take the text from the image of the whiteboard that you saw before, and then convert that into a Quarto HTML document, all while keeping the text formatting the same. The model's able to do that on the first go, and is able to correctly identify where the headings should go and where the math should go. And the file that you see here is actually what it generated, and this works on the first go without errors. And if you render it, this is what it looks like. And I copied and pasted that directly from the actual Quarto document that was generated. So it really did turn out looking like that. I just made things a little bit bigger so that it wouldn't look so funny on these big screens. Even with more complicated handwriting, I've been really impressed with the model's ability to read and process math. So with this prompt, I'm not only asking it to convert the image into a Quarto HTML document, but this time I'm also asking it to add styling so that the colors in the document match the colors of the pens that I was using. And once again, the model has no trouble doing this for us. Using images as inputs also comes in handy if you've got data that are printed out. And if you've ever had a job doing data entry, you're definitely going to appreciate how easy GPT-4o makes this. You can digitize the data and then ask questions about that data all in the same chat. And the data that you see on the screen here is entirely fake. It was actually simulated using GPT-4o, and it's just something that shows the annual salary for a bunch of made-up job roles in industries. And I'm going to be using this data set in the next few examples. So first, I'm asking ChatGPT to convert that table into a more usable format. A CSV is generated, and then I can download that CSV from within the chat. Not only can you see an interactive preview of the data set, but you can also modify it on the fly too. So you can do things like highlight different columns or cells, and then provide data cleaning or data formatting instructions. You can also do things like simulate additional observations, including for variables that don't even exist on the data set. So here I'm asking it to simulate additional observations so that there's a total of 1,000 rows in the data set. And then I'm also asking it to create two new variables, one representing the number of years of experience and the highest level, the other one being the highest level of education attained. Whenever you make modifications to the data set, the downloadable CSV is also going to be updated accordingly to reflect those changes. And then if you want to know how those modifications were applied, you can click on the View Analysis button to see the underlying code that was run to generate those changes. And while it's awesome to be able to provide data to the model in unconventional ways, like uploading an image or simulating data, you can, of course, provide data sets in more conventional ways as well, like uploading a file from your computer or connecting to OneDrive or Google Drive. Once you've got some data that you're ready to analyze, doing so is as easy as asking. You can ask for things like a short overview of the data set, summary statistics, or other exploratory analysis. One of the prompts that I've been using and finding really helpful is asking the model to extract key insights and then pull those key insights together into a short paragraph. And I realize that the data set that I'm using here is entirely fake, so those insights, not interesting at all. But you can see how something like this would be a great starting point if you were analyzing real data. With the advanced data analysis feature, you can easily make quick visualizations like scatter plots and box plots, heat maps, to name just a few. And with certain types of data visualizations, the plots are now interactive. So that means that you can do things like hover over any of the data points or change any of the colors. Once you're happy with how the plot looks, you can download it as an image. And if you want to create more complicated data visualizations, you can do that. But the model doesn't currently support interactivity for data visualizations that look like that. But with that being said, you can still make stuff that looks like that and have it appear in the chat. It's just going to show up as a static image instead of an interactive plot. And at this point, I know there's probably some people in the room who might be thinking, is this going to take my job? Like, this is exactly what I do at work. And I know that that's a really scary thought. But what I want to show is that doing this actually takes quite a lot of data analysis expertise. Prompt engineering is a skill that's going to go hand in hand with your existing data science and programming skills, rather than one that's going to replace the other. And the reason why I say that is because the key to getting these plots to look right is to be really, really specific and detailed in your prompts. In the next few slides, we're going to build up this plot that you see here, which is a bar chart that shows the average annual salary grouped by job role and industry. But we're going to do this using just one very detailed prompt. And the way that I like to do this is by building things up in the same way that I would if I were using ggplot. So I like to think about building the prompt up layer by layer, using the grammar of graphics, but by using natural language instead of code. Okay, I hope everyone's ready, because you're all about to become professional prompt engineers. First, we tell the model the data that we'd like to use, and here I'm using that job salaries data set from the example from before. Next, we're going to specify which aesthetics we want to map onto each axis, and I'm putting average salary on the y-axis and job role on the x-axis. And then I'm also asking for each job role to have a different color on the plot. Next, we're going to need to specify which type of data visualization we'd like to create. And here, I'm trying to create a bar chart. But specifically, I want to create a bar chart that's grouped by or faceted by the industry variable. We can also add other statistics to the plot as well. For example, a horizontal line showing the average salary for each industry. And then the variable that's on the y-axis is a dollar value. So I want to add some formatting here by getting some dollar signs and some commas. And then I want this plot to look nice, but I don't want to spend a bunch of time fiddling around with themes and color palettes. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT for help with this. So here I'm asking for a modern color palette and a minimal theme. And then I want the legend to be displayed on the right side of the plot. All in all, this is the final prompt. And it's very long. But it's also specific enough that it's going to give us exactly what we want. And with just that one prompt, GPT-4o not only shows us the code that's necessary in order to generate that visualization, but then it's also going to execute that code and display the image in the chat. And this is because you can now run Python code from directly within the chat. And this is a huge improvement over what we've seen in the past. Because now you're going to be able to see right away whether or not there's errors in the code, and you don't need to copy-paste the code into an IDE in order to execute it. And if you want to make iterative updates to the code, you don't have to worry about switching back and forth between different windows. These are just a few of the ways that GPT-4o can be helpful for data analysis, but the possibilities are truly endless. And if you want to learn more about the model's capabilities, you can check it out on OpenAI's website. The examples that I've talked about so far are mostly for quick and dirty data exploration, but you can also use OpenAI's models programmatically in your scripts as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so for this part of the talk, I want to address the people in the room who are tired of hearing about generative AI. Now, there's different reasons why you might be feeling this way, but if you're anything like me, then your relationship with generative AI might feel a bit like the experience of getting a new kitchen gadget. A couple of Christmases ago, I was super excited to be gifted an ice cream maker. The advertising on the box said it was only going to take 20 minutes to make the ice cream, so I thought this was going to be a really fun and convenient way to have ice cream whenever I wanted. But when it came time to actually make the ice cream, it turns out that it takes 20 minutes after you've pre-frozen the bowl by putting it in the freezer for a full 24 hours. Definitely not as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. And now this gadget that I was once super excited about isn't getting used at all and is just collecting dust, because it doesn't really feel practical enough for regular use. I tried out the ice cream maker a few times, and it kind of worked. But eventually I just realized that buying the pre-made store-bought ice cream was a lot easier, and honestly took about the same amount of time. And you might feel the same way about generative AI. Despite your initial excitement, the lack of practical, convenient use cases that you can integrate into your everyday workflow might have you feeling like it's just another overhyped kitchen gadget taking up counter space. Instead of letting it go completely unused, though, I want to show you some creative use cases that you hopefully haven't seen before that might make Gen AI feel as exciting again as it did that first day that you used it. This section is going to be a little bit more technical than the first, so I want to start by giving a quick preview of what I'm going to talk about before I get too deep into the nitty-gritty technical details. First, I'm going to talk about a Quarto Reveal.js theme generator that I made. Next, I'm going to talk about an easy way to use Gen AI to make hex sticker designs. And finally, I'm going to talk about some tools that make teaching and communicating about data a little bit easier. When working with data, there are often things that we do that are really important parts of the process, but that end up taking way longer than we want them to. It's often been said that the vast majority of data analysis is actually data cleaning, but I find for myself, my process looks a little bit more like this. And I know that I'm not alone. Making things look pretty is something that this particular community is really, really good at. And if you're someone like Allison or Megan or Emil, then you probably don't mind spending a lot of time on making things look pretty. But if you're someone like me, and you're not artistically talented, but you still care about making things look nice, then you might find yourself wishing there was an easier way. So if you're someone who finds fiddling with CSS and color palettes to be kind of tedious, then I want you to know that you're not alone. And I want to share with you some ways that I've been using generative AI to cut down on the amount of time that I spend on making things look pretty, specifically when it comes to Quarto. I've given quite a few talks over the last few years, which means I've spent quite a lot of time on making Quarto slide decks look nice. This is entirely a me problem, because every time I give a new talk, I want the theme to be something that people have never seen before, and I also want it to be something that goes really well with the content of the slides themselves. So like this talk, for example, when I was picking out a theme, I wanted to make sure that I picked something that was like fairly modern and minimal looking, because it just would not have made sense to give a talk about AI and use Comic Sans. And because I'm giving talks, I want to make my slides publicly available to other people. And I want to do this in a way that's fully reproducible, where people can access not only the slides themselves, but also all of the underlying files that generate them. Whenever I make changes to the content of the slides, I want all of that to be version controlled. And I also want the public-facing version of the slides to be automatically updated as well. So this makes GitHub pages perfect for the job. And if there's anyone in the audience who's wondering if I used Quarto and GitHub pages for this talk, the answer is no. Because this slide deck has over 220 slides in it, most of which just have images on them. And if you've ever made a Quarto presentation before, then you know that that would have taken way, way too long. But in general, I do try to use Quarto and GitHub pages for presentations. Now, if you've never used GitHub pages to host a Quarto project before, then I think the best way that I can describe it is that it kind of feels like assembling a puzzle. The end result is super satisfying, but you might spend hours searching for that one missing piece. And the reason why I say that is because the file structure and folder structure that you need to use in order to get everything working correctly is honestly, it's a little bit complicated. But the good news is that once you've figured out how to successfully assemble this puzzle once, you're always going to know exactly how it all fits together. Whenever you make a new Quarto theme and you host it using GitHub Pages, this folder structure that you see here is going to be the exact same every single time. And if you want to make a new slide theme, it's really only a handful of files that need to be modified. So you're going to need any images that you want to use for the slide backgrounds, and then you're also going to need to make some modifications to the custom SCSS file. Within the custom SCSS file, it's actually only a handful of lines of code that need to be modified. And in particular, it's really just those strings that you see highlighted there in yellow that need to be modified at all in order to create an entirely new looking theme. And that's because if we change just those strings that are highlighted in yellow, then that means that we'd be changing the main font family and the color palette. And those are the styling elements that are going to make the largest, most noticeable differences. Now, we know that the folder structure stays the same each time. And we know that all we need to do in order to create a new theme is generate some new images and make some minimal styling changes to the custom SCSS file. And we also know that generative AI is pretty good at generating images and at writing code. So we can combine all of this information together and conclude that creating Quarto themes is a use case that's perfect for generative AI. So with all of these facts in mind, I developed a Shiny app that starts by setting up this consistent file structure. And then it uses Gen AI to create new images for the slide backgrounds. And then the app uses ChatGPT to generate styling suggestions and then update the custom SCSS file accordingly. The app looks like this, and if you want to use it, all you need to do is enter in a phrase for the theme and then provide your OpenAI API key. Once you click on the Generate My Theme button, all of the files that are necessary for the project are going to be generated for you. You can then download those files, and if you push the repo to GitHub, then the slides are going to be automatically hosted using GitHub Pages without you needing to modify any of the files. So everything's already properly configured for you. So for example, I used the phrase abstract purple minimal, and here's the resulting slide deck that was generated for me. And I didn't modify any of these files, so this is actually what it produced. And I know it doesn't look as pretty as it would have if someone like Allison or Megan or Emil had made it, but I think it looks pretty good. If you're interested in trying this app out for yourself, I'm going to share the link to it in a couple of minutes. But I first want to talk about how generative AI is being used here. So first, the background images are generated using the image generation endpoint from the OpenAI API. And then the prompt that's passed to the model is a concatenation of the user's input phrase and the words desktop background. And you might be wondering, oh, actually, forgot about this slide. So if, for example, let's say you know that you want to create like a softer color palette for your theme, and so you decide to use the phrase pastel chalk. Then what the app is going to do is it's going to take that phrase and then modify it so that the words desktop background are added, and the phrase that actually gets passed to the prompt or to the image generation model is going to be pastel chalk desktop background. And you might be wondering why that's necessary. And the reason is because if we don't include the words desktop background, then the model's probably going to try to create a really photorealistic image like that. Whereas if we include the words desktop background, then we're going to get something that looks a lot more appropriate for background images in a slide deck. From here, The app then changes the opacity of the images to 20% so that if there's any text on the slides, it's actually going to be visible. To generate the styling suggestions, the code looks really similar to what we saw before, but this time it's the chat completions endpoint that's being used. And then the prompt that gets sent to the model is super long, and it says, based on the user's input phrase, recommend a Google font, a color palette consisting of 3 colors, and a Pandoc syntax highlighting theme. And then the key part of the prompt is the stuff that's at the bottom there. And here I'm specifying the format that I want the results to come back in. And I'm asking for it to come back in a JSON format so that the results are going to come back in a way that I can use them programmatically instead of getting back a big long paragraph. And then finally, this information is then used to populate the custom SCSS file. And if you want to see the details on how it gets populated, then you can scan the QR code on the left, and that's going to take you to the Shiny app on shinyapps.io. From there, you can try the app out for yourself, or you can take a look at the underlying code that generates it. If you want to see a video tutorial on how to use the app and how to upload everything so that it is all working with GitHub pages, then I've got a video on my YouTube channel, which you can access by scanning the QR code on the right. And I've also got lots of step-by-step tutorials there as well, if you're interested in learning more about how to automate things in general using GitHub Actions. When I was preparing for this talk and trying to decide what to include in it, I messaged a lot of different people to get their perspective on what they thought might be interesting to this particular audience. A while back, I was chatting with one of the other keynote speakers, Hannes, and he said that he really liked the idea of talking about practical applications of Gen AI in data science. And he also humorously shared with me that he wasn't quite sure how a cat picture generator could ever come in handy to someone who works with data. And when I saw that message, I thought to myself, yeah, you know what? That's totally fair. There's definitely not a ton of obvious ways to use a cat picture generator as a data scientist. And if I'm being completely honest, the only way that I'd ever seen image generators being used in my everyday life was in a group chat at my workplace for our R and Python user group, or RPUG for short. One of my colleagues, Jude, would regularly send these hilarious AI-generated images of pugs, and everyone in the chat would have a great time trying to find everything that was wrong and broken with the images. And while this is a great use case that definitely improved morale, Hannes's message did make me wonder, is there a more practical way for people who work with data to use a cat picture generator? So I thought about it, and I want to share with you an example of exactly how a cat picture generator might come in handy to this audience. So imagine you've just created an awesome new R package, and you want to make a hex sticker, which means you need a logo to represent the package. And for the sake of this discussion, let's say that this package just so happens to be themed around cats. If you want to make a logo for a package, then you're probably looking for an image that's got a transparent background and that can be scaled fairly easily without becoming too pixelated. There's now text-to-SVG generators that are perfect for exactly this. You just enter in a phrase, and then an editable vector graphic is created for you. There's a ton of different services that offer this, but if you're looking for a free option, then Recraft AI might be a great solution for you. Super easy to get started. You just enter a prompt, and then you specify a few options. You can set the height and width ratio. You can optionally specify a color palette. You can set how simple or how detailed you want the image to be. And then you can choose from a ton of different art styles. And when I say a ton, I mean a ton. I only put a few on this slide, but Recraft AI has over 20 different styles for generating vector images. Some of the styles are definitely better suited than others, depending on what you're trying to use the image for. And I find that if you're trying to make a hex sticker, then the cartoon style works pretty well. And just like with other image generators, you can do things like fine-tune or generate variations. And then because the image that's been created is a vector graphic rather than a raster image, you can also easily change any of the colors. Once you've got an image that you're happy with, you can easily turn it into a hex sticker design. Recraft AI also has a lot of other really cool features too, including the ability to generate mockups, which is awesome if you want to see what something's going to look like before you order a bunch of them. Next, I want to talk about two tools that make teaching and communicating about data a little bit easier. The first is a tool called Scribe, and Scribe allows you to automatically create step-by-step tutorials without needing to copy-paste screenshots or record any videos. This is super helpful if you want to teach someone how to do a programming task. As a simple example, let's say I want to show someone how to make a new R project using Posit Cloud. So first, I would start the capture using the Scribe Chrome extension, and then Scribe is going to start automatically writing numbered instructions based on what I'm doing in the capture. Anytime I click somewhere or type something, the screenshot's going to be automatically generated for me. And then the location where I've typed or clicked is going to be highlighted in orange. If I don't like the way that any of the descriptions have been written, I can click on the instruction to modify what it says. Once the capture is stopped, you can use Gen AI to create a title and a description for the tutorial. Again, both of which can be modified if you don't like them. Once you're happy with the tutorial, you can share it for free with others, either by a direct link or by email, or you can embed it as an iframe, for example, in a Quarto website. Now, using the Scribe Chrome extension is free, but there's also a pro subscription available, which gives you access to things like the desktop version of Scribe. And the desktop version is awesome if you've got something that you want to show someone how to do using an IDE that you only have installed locally on your machine. The Pro subscription also comes with the ability to export in a variety of really useful formats, including Markdown. So the last tool that I want to talk about that I find really helpful for teaching data science is called Descript. And this is honestly probably one of the coolest things I have ever used. I've used Descript to edit every single YouTube video that I've made in the last 3 years, and this has saved me countless hours of video editing. And that's because if you use Descript, you can edit videos or podcasts as if you're editing a Word document. So you just upload the video or audio file into Descript, and then it's going to be transcribed for you. Transcription is available in over 20 different languages, and it's really impressively accurate, sorry, even for technical words and phrases. Once the transcript is ready, you can edit the transcript in order to edit the video itself. So if I've got this paragraph highlighted here, and then I delete that paragraph, it's going to automatically trim the video to the correct locations. With the click of a button, you can do things like remove awkward silences and filler words, which is great if you're someone who's guilty of saying way too much. Descript also has AI speech generation capabilities, and you can make a clone of your own voice in as little as 60 seconds. So if you don't like the way that a word sounded when you originally recorded it, you can use your voice clone to regenerate the content. And if you don't like the wording that you used and you want to change that up altogether, then you can use the overdub feature to replace it without needing to re-record the clip. Descript also has a lot of other really cool AI-powered features as well. For example, they've got an eye contact feature, which is going to make it look like you're making eye contact with the camera, even if you're not. So if you're someone who makes videos using a script, then you don't need to memorize that script. You can just read it directly from your screen, and it's going to make it look like you're looking directly into the camera anyways. If you're a perfectionist like me, and you often find yourself re-recording sentences when you make videos because you want them to sound perfect, then you're going to love Descript's Remove Retakes feature. Descript is going to automatically detect your repeated takes, and then you can remove the bad takes instantly. A feature that I've been using a lot and finding super helpful is the YouTube description generator. So from your transcript, Descript is going to generate a YouTube-style video description, including detecting where chapters should go, and then providing the timestamps for those chapters in the generated video description. So if you're someone who loves talking about or teaching about data science, but you've been feeling overwhelmed about the amount of work that it takes to edit videos or podcasts, then I really recommend giving Descript a try. If you didn't find yourself fitting into those first two categories, then maybe you resonate more with the idea of being fearful of generative AI. Maybe you're afraid that AI-powered machines are going to take over the world, and our AI overlords are going to keep us trapped in a vat of goop, forcing us to live in a simulated universe for the rest of our lives. But I know that I'm giving this talk to a really technical audience, so I think most people in this room probably have a pretty intuitive sense of what these models are and aren't capable of. So I know that fearful isn't exactly the right word. But really, though, this part of the talk is for anyone who wants some guidance on how to use these tools more responsibly. And I know I've been making a few jokes up here, but this is the part of the talk where things are going to be a little bit more serious. The Government of Canada has put together a guide on the use of generative AI, and the target audience for that guide is for public servants. And I'm a Canadian public servant, so I personally think the guide is pretty good. But I think that regardless of what you do for your job or what context you're using Gen AI in, this guide has a lot of really useful tips in it. You can find the guide at the link at the bottom, but that link is super long. So it's definitely easiest if you just Google guide on the use of generative AI and then click on the link that's from the Government of Canada. This guide is super detailed, but they've also developed a really convenient acronym that highlights the key principles. The acronym is FASTER, and it stands for fair, accountable, secure, transparent, educated, and relevant. Fair means ensuring that outputs are accessible, inclusive, and comply with human rights. Many of these models have used publicly available data from the internet as part of their training data, which means that these models have the potential to produce outputs that amplify historical biases and stereotypes and other types of harmful information. So it's really important to always manually review outputs and remove anything that's biased, non-inclusive, or discriminatory. Gen AI should never be used to make decisions about an individual that could impact them materially or legally, or lead to a discrimination in services. Doing this could violate human rights, but it's also against the terms of service for most of the popular tools. So for example, OpenAI has a policy that prohibits its users from using the models to make decisions about an individual related to things like credit and housing and employment. And then Google's also got a Gen AI prohibited use policy, which contains some pretty similar terms. Accountable means ensuring that outputs are accurate, legal, and ethical. To ensure that outputs are accurate, they should always be manually reviewed by a human to make sure that it's factually correct. Large language models shouldn't be used as search engines, And they also shouldn't be used for tasks that you're not already somewhat skilled in yourself. So for example, if I'm using Gen AI to help me out with a programming task, the key word there is always help. I'm asking the model to help me out with something that I already know how to do myself, and I'm asking it to use packages that I either already know and use, or that I've got the documentation for opened up side by side. And this way I can actually verify that what's being produced makes sense, follows best practices, and uses a style that other people actually use. Keeping track of the legalities isn't always easy if you're not a lawyer, so consult your organization's legal department if you have one. If you don't have one, try your best to stay up to date on policy related to AI regulation however you can. And at a bare minimum, make sure you've read the terms of service for any tools that you're using and ensure that your usage is compliant. Make an effort to determine whether or not the methods used to obtain the training data were legal and ethical. And you can lower your risk of copyright issues by only using Gen AI for tasks that are less likely to include copyright-protected information. So for example, that means that you can use it to do things like edit or improve content that you wrote yourself, rather than generating content completely from scratch. Secure means ensuring that personal information and privacy are protected at all times. Never enter sensitive or personal information, and always abstract away as much as you possibly can. You should use synthetic data where possible, or you can even go a step further and just change all of the variable names in your prompt. So take the prompt that you actually want to ask, and then replace all of the variables with more generic names, and then just change everything back after the fact. You should also make sure that you've actually read the terms of service in full, and that you understand whether or not your inputs are going to be used as training data or to otherwise further improve model performance in the future. Try to opt out of this feature where possible, and prioritize using services that do have an opt-out option. Transparent means being upfront about how Gen AI tools are being used. So if you've used generative AI for a project, then it's really important to keep a detailed record about how it was used. If you make a public-facing tool that uses Gen AI, then it's extremely important to inform users of this. The way that you inform users might be different depending on the type of content. So for example, if you've generated an image, you might want to include a watermark. Or if it's content that's text-based, then you might want to include a note. And then the types of information that should be incorporated into these notes includes the exact tool and the version that was used, how the tool works and why it's being used, and to what extent outputs were reviewed or modified. And all of this should be explained in a non-technical way. Educated means being knowledgeable about Gen AI tools before using them. So this means understanding the strengths and limitations of different models, and also understanding how to use these tools more responsibly. It also means knowing how to write effective prompts. Most of the popular tools have really great documentation that shows you how to get the best possible results for that specific model. But you might also find that taking a formal course or workshop on prompt engineering is really helpful. And finally, being educated about Gen AI means keeping yourself up to date on the newest advancements and best practices. Doing this can be really, really challenging because this space is constantly evolving. But subscribing to newsletters or participating in communities of practice is a great way to do this. There's also a ton of talks at this conference about generative AI that I really recommend checking out, including an entire session tomorrow afternoon on exactly this topic. R is the last letter in the FASTER acronym, and it stands for relevant. Relevant means determining if Gen AI is really relevant to the task at hand. We talked today about some examples of use cases that lend themselves really well to generative AI, but there's definitely a ton of others that don't. And if you try to use Gen AI when it's not necessary, it's kind of like watering your houseplants with a hose. You can technically do it, but it's definitely overkill. It's going to take way longer than the traditional method of doing it, and you're making a huge mess for no reason. Regardless of how you're using it, if you're using Gen AI, aligning your usage with the FASTER principles is a great way to ensure more responsible use. When I first started working on this talk, I was definitely Gen AI fatigued, so I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity to start to feel like all three of these again. Regardless of which one you most see yourself as, I hope this talk had something that you found beneficial. Whether you love Gen AI, hate it, or are somewhere in between, my goal was to provide practical, actionable tips to make your everyday life easier. These tools are always changing, and keeping up to date can be really difficult, but one thing that's always remained constant is the need to be really, really specific and detailed with your prompts, and to build things up layer by layer using the existing expertise that you already have and the mental models that you already understand. Thinking outside of the box to identify practical, creative use cases is a great way to avoid feeling the fatigue, or at least to minimize it. Because I know for myself, I'm always going to feel exhausted by these posts on LinkedIn. And finally, finding a framework that'll help you and your organization use Gen AI more responsibly is key to addressing hesitancy and fear. The FASTER principles are a great example of this. Regardless of how you feel about generative AI, I am super happy to chat more about any of this. So please feel free to come say hi to me over the next few days, or you can find my contact information on the screen. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Melissa. So as you can see from the link on the slide, if you want to ask questions, please go to Slido, either ask a question or upvote one of the ones that's there. So we've got a few to get started with. Gen AI has a significant carbon footprint for both training the models and making predictions from them. How do you think we should manage enthusiasm given the potential environmental impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the R part of that FASTER acronym really comes in handy here. Because there's such a high cost to doing these things, it's really important to consider carefully whether or not it actually needs to be used, and try to not use it when it's not necessary in order to minimize that impact.
Thanks. So the next question definitely occurred to me as well. So when you're creating that visualization, it felt like you spent so much time coming up with the prompt. Wouldn't it have been easier to just write the ggplot2 code?
Yes, and it's only an hour-long talk, so it's hard to fit everything in. But originally, the thing that I wanted to say there was that that's kind of the point. If you want the results to be really good, it's actually going to take about the same amount of time as it would to just write the code. But the key benefit here is that you don't need to memorize the syntax. So you're still using the same concepts that you already know from that programming background, but you don't have to remember all the little details.
Yeah, I will say personally that I have used ChatGPT to ask questions about ggplot2 and how to change things in the theme. I don't even remember that stuff. As someone who works with EHR data, I am hesitant to use Copilot because of concerns around sharing patient health information accidentally. Can you kind of share your thoughts on what happens when you're working with confidential data? Maybe you've got experience using local models.
Yeah, so my recommendation would be just don't. Don't use it for anything that is sensitive or confidential, unless like maybe your organization has specific policies on that, and then maybe it's okay. But yeah, for myself personally, like this is stuff that I'm doing in my personal time, where I know the stuff that's being provided is not confidential, and it's like stuff that I would put on GitHub or wherever anyways. And a rule that I like to think of is just like, if it were posted publicly online, like my entire prompt history, would I be comfortable with that? And if the answer is no, then I probably shouldn't be asking that prompt.
I think that criteria would not work for me because I'd be embarrassed by how many stupid questions.
Same.
I read a comment saying I was impressed by how well it did putting things into Quarto, especially given like how new Quarto is. Like, do you think it works, like LLMs, Gen AI still work pretty well even on newer or less commonly used topics?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I think if this talk were happening like 6 months ago, my answer would probably be no. Like, no, it's not the greatest at knowing how to do stuff with newer tools. But with GPT-4o in particular, you can provide like documentation, or you can also ask it to like Google things, and it has the ability to like access the internet. So yeah, now if there's a tool that was like just released, like a package that just came out, you can just provide a link to the documentation for that package, and it's going to be able to read that and then give you actually good answers.
This isn't directly related to generative AI, but I think it's an interesting question. The internet can be a horrible place.
Yes.
And how do you kind of deal with that as like a content creator? How do you deal with the trolls and other awful people?
Oof. Well, I think personally I've been pretty lucky, thankfully. I think that's in large part because the community that we have here is so awesome. I haven't really had any like toxic comments or anything. If I did, I would definitely delete them. I think like the worst comment that I've got was just like mentioning that I have some vocal fry in my voice, so that's not that's not too bad.
Okay, we'll take one last question, and this was of interest to me as well. So how much time do you spend researching which generator to use for a specific purpose? Like, how do you decide what to go with, and how do you keep up with, how do you find all these sites with cool AI-powered features?
Yeah, I use like OpenAI more than pretty much anything else. But honestly, I think just like LinkedIn. I follow a lot of people on there, and just like that's pretty much the only way that I keep up to date with what's going on in this space.
Cool. Thanks, Melissa. Please join me in thanking Melissa one last time.